Still taking public transport? My mother's voice cut across the Thanksgiving table before I'd even finished hanging my coat over the back of the chair. 12 faces turned toward me. I glanced at Mom. I took the train, walked the last few blocks. She laughed like I'd just confessed something humiliating. Unbelievable. Diane pointed across the table toward my younger sister. Melissa has 4 cars now, Judith. 4. Melissa shifted in her seat. Her Mercedes SUV was parked outside beside her Porsche, and Mom had already spent 10 minutes telling everyone about the Range Rover she'd bought that month. Dad leaned back with a smirk. 34 years old and still riding buses. Pathetic. Aunt Carol cleared her throat. Robert, maybe we should. No, she needs to hear it. Mom interrupted. Then she looked straight at me. I told you years ago you'll never own a car if you keep making choices like this. I didn't answer. I checked my watch. 6:42 p.m. Mom noticed. What? Somewhere more important to be. My phone vibrated beside my plate. Fleet operations. Arrival window moved forward. I turned the screen face down. Melissa gave me an apologetic glance, but Mom was already describing her 4 cars again as if they were medals. That, she said, gesturing toward Melissa, is what happens when someone understands success. Another vibration. Marcus Aviation. I declined the call. Dad frowned. Who keeps calling you? Work. Mom waved dismissively. Judith works with buses. A cousin looked at me. You do. Something like that. Mom smiled triumphantly as if I had confirmed everything she had ever told them about me. What she didn't know was that less than an hour away, 6 aircraft connected to the company I controlled were being repositioned for an operation that required my approval, and nobody at that table even knew the company's name. Mom lifted her wine glass. To Melissa, she announced, for proving what hard work looks like. And maybe by next Thanksgiving, Judith will finally have something with 4 wheels sitting in the driveway. Dad laughed. This time I didn't let it pass. Mom. Her glass stopped halfway to her lips. Do you actually know what I do? The table went quiet. She blinked. Of course I do. What? You work for some transportation company. Which one? Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Dad looked down at his plate. For years, they had decided that because I didn't own a personal car, I couldn't possibly be successful. I dressed well, but never wore obvious labels. My phone was ordinary. I didn't talk about money. And when Mom bragged that Melissa's luxury real estate career had bought her a Mercedes, Porsche, restored convertible, and Range Rover, I never competed. Silence had been easier. Until that night. My phone vibrated again. Airport arrival confirmed. Executive attendance required. I read it, then looked through the dining room window at the darkening sky. When I turned back, Mom was studying me differently. For the first time all evening, she wasn't laughing. And I could almost see the question forming behind her eyes. If I wasn't struggling at all, then what exactly had I been keeping from them? Mom waited until everyone drifted into the living room before following me into the kitchen. I was rinsing my coffee cup when she shut the door behind her. You embarrassed me in there. I turned off the faucet. I embarrassed you? Yes. Challenging me in front of everyone like that. I asked if you knew what I did for a living. You knew how that sounded. I dried my hands slowly. Why does it bother you so much that I don't own a car? Mom stared at me like the answer should have been obvious. Because people notice things, Judith. They judge families by how their children turn out. There it was. Not whether I was happy, not whether I could support myself, not whether I had built anything worthwhile, whether I looked successful enough for her. You think me taking a train makes you look bad? I think a woman your age should have something to show for herself. I almost smiled. Instead, I leaned against the counter. You said the same thing when I was 22. Her expression changed slightly. Back then, I had been trying to get my first transportation venture off the ground. I barely had enough money to keep the business alive, and I had asked my parents for temporary help buying a used car. Nothing fancy, just something reliable enough to get between client meetings. Mom had looked at the listing and pushed my phone back across the table. You'll never own a car until you learn how the real world works. I never asked them for money again. A few months later, Melissa came home talking about how much she loved a luxury sedan she'd test-driven. Mom helped with the down payment. I didn't bring up the difference then. I just walked. Now, 12 years later, Mom crossed her arms. If you're still upset about that, you should have said something. I'm not upset about the car. Then what is this? The fact that you still think owning one proves anything. She sighed and opened her purse. I can help you find out something modest. I looked at her. She misunderstood my silence and continued. Nothing embarrassing. A decent used car. Then we don't have to keep having this conversation every holiday. What if I don't need one? Mom gave a short laugh. Everyone successful needs a car. No, everyone successful needs transportation. Those aren't the same thing. There you go again, turning everything into some philosophical excuse. My phone rang. I looked down. Marcus Aviation. This time I answered, Judith. Marcus spoke quickly. I listened, then said, move the arrival to Hangar 3. Mom's eyes shifted toward me. I turned slightly away. Yes, keep all 6 aircraft on schedule. I'll meet the airport director personally. A pause. No, don't delay for me. I'm leaving now. I ended the call. Mom was staring. What exactly was that? Work. 6 aircraft. Yes. Her tone changed. Did you get promoted? I picked up my coat from the chair beside the kitchen door. A long time ago. To what? I slipped one arm into the sleeve. Mom, I'm not doing this so you can compare my job title with Melissa's sales numbers. That's not what I'm doing. It's exactly what you've done for years. The kitchen door opened. Dad stepped in. What's going on? I have to leave, I said. He frowned. You're leaving Thanksgiving early? There's an aviation operation at the airport that needs me there. Dad looked at Mom, then back at me. What, are you some kind of dispatcher now? Mom suddenly grabbed her coat from the hook by the back door. Fine. I looked at her. She pulled it on. I'll drive you. Then maybe I'll finally see this mysterious job you're always hiding. The room went still. She clearly expected me to refuse. I watched her for several seconds. Then I picked up my bag. All right. You know, Mom said as she turned toward the airport, if you had your own car, none of us would need to do this. I watched the city lights pass outside the window. I didn't ask you to drive me. That silenced her for about 30 seconds. Dad had insisted on coming after hearing the word aviation. Melissa came too, mostly because Mom had announced that it was time everyone finally discovered what my mysterious transportation job actually involved. When signs for the private aviation terminal appeared, Dad leaned forward. This is where you work? Sometimes. Mom glanced at me. Sometimes. I didn't answer. She pulled into the terminal entrance. Before we had even reached the security checkpoint, the guard stepped from his booth. He looked through the windshield, spotted me in the passenger seat, and immediately straightened. Good evening, Miss Carter. Mom's hands tightened around the steering wheel. You know her? The guard ignored the question. Hangar 3 is prepared. Mr. Wallace is waiting at the terminal. Thank you, I said. The barrier lifted. Dad stopped smiling. Mom drove forward more slowly. At the terminal entrance, a man in a dark overcoat was already coming down the steps. Judith. He shook my hand. Glad you made it. We moved the ground crews as requested. Any issues? None. 2 operations managers approached behind him. Ms. Carter, all 6 aircraft are on schedule. Good. Keep the turnaround teams ready. Mom stepped out of the car. Excuse me. Everyone looked to her. She pointed toward me. What exactly is her position here? One manager hesitated. The airport official answered. Ms. Carter is executive chair of Astron Mobility Group. Melissa's eyebrows shot upward. Executive chair? Dad looked at me. You run Astron? Mom recovered first. Well, she obviously worked her way up. I looked at Dad. I never said I worked a small job. You decided that. We entered the terminal. A polished Astron Mobility emblem stretched across one wall. Mom stopped walking. I know that name. Of course she did. Astron buses operated across several metropolitan routes. Our airport shuttles served multiple cities, and our freight division had vehicles on highways throughout the region. Dad stared at the emblem. I've seen those trucks. An operations manager joined us. The aviation team expects the first helicopters in approximately 15 minutes. Mom looked toward the runway. Helicopters. Several Astron aircraft are being repositioned after today's regional executive transport operation, he explained. Melissa looked at me differently now, not competitively, almost impressed. Mom, however, seemed more concerned with recovering from what she'd said at dinner. When another executive approached, she immediately smiled. "We're Judith's parents," she announced. "We're extremely proud of how far she's risen in the company." I said nothing. Less than an hour earlier, she'd offered to finance me a used car so I would stop embarrassing her. Now she wanted strangers to know I was her daughter. The executive frowned slightly. "Risen?" Mom nodded eagerly. "Yes, we had no idea she'd climbed this high." His eyes moved from Mom to me, then back again. "Mrs. Carter?" Mom's smile faded. He seemed genuinely confused. "Judith didn't rise through Astron." Dad stepped closer. "What do you mean?" The executive glanced at me once more before answering. "Judith created Astron." Mom stared at the executive. "Created it?" Dad stepped forward before she could recover. "You mean she founded one of the divisions?" The executive shook his head. "No, Judith founded the original company. Everything else grew from there." Mom turned toward me. I could see her searching my face for some indication that this was a misunderstanding. The executive continued, unaware of what had happened at Thanksgiving. "Mrs. Carter remains Astron Mobility Group's controlling owner." Melissa slowly lowered her phone. "Wait." She looked at me. "When you told me you were opening another route last year, Astron. And when you said you'd acquired an aviation operator, Astron." Her mouth parted. "The board meetings?" I nodded. "The commuter service you kept writing because you said you were testing it, also Astron." Melissa stared at the floor for a moment. "You never actually said you worked for somebody else." "No." Mom's voice came out quieter. "Why didn't you correct us?" Before I could answer, one of the operations managers approached. "Miss Carter, they're coming in." We turned toward the terminal windows. Beyond the runway lights, several points appeared against the evening sky. The low rhythm of rotor blades gradually became audible. Mom moved closer to the glass. The first helicopter descended toward the illuminated landing area, followed at a controlled distance by another. Astron's insignia was visible on the fuselage. Mom swallowed. "Those belong to your company, our aviation subsidiary." Her eyes remained fixed on the aircraft. Dad's reaction was different. He turned immediately toward me. "So how wealthy are you?" I looked at him. That was his first question. Not "how did you build this?" Not "how long have you been doing this?" "Money." "You never told us you were rich," he continued. "I told you what I was working on plenty of times. You weren't interested." Mom finally turned from the window. "But if you have helicopters and company vehicles, why are you riding trains?" "Because I run a transportation company." That doesn't answer the question. It does. I stepped closer to the glass as another aircraft descended. Astron was built around ordinary passengers. If executives only experience transportation from the back of chauffeur cars, we stop seeing what our customers see. Melissa listened silently. "I ride our services without announcing who I am," I continued. "I see delays, dirty stations, ticketing problems, accessibility issues, how passengers are treated. Reports tell me numbers. Writing tells me what those numbers feel like." Mom shook her head slowly. "So, Thanksgiving, all those times we laughed about the bus, you were laughing at something I was doing deliberately." Her face tightened. An airport employee approached to tell me the executive reception would begin shortly. I looked at my parents. "You can come." Mom blinked. "To the reception?" "Yes. Company leadership will be there. Investors, regional partners." Her posture changed almost immediately. "I'd like that." Of course she would. Melissa caught my eye. Unlike Mom, she seemed to understand that I wasn't inviting them there to impress them. I was simply finished hiding reality to protect them from their own assumptions. We entered the reception area as the last aircraft completed its approach. Before Mom could start another question, a familiar voice stopped me. "Judith." My chief financial officer walked toward us carrying a briefing folder. He handed it directly to me. "The updated independent valuation is confirmed." I opened the folder. Mom was standing close enough to see the first page. Her eyes dropped to the figure printed beneath Astron Mobility Group. She stopped breathing for a second. Then all the color disappeared from her face. Mom kept staring at the page. Her lips moved before any sound came out. 2.3 billion? The reception continued around us. Quiet conversations, glasses touching, executives greeting arriving guests. But my family stood frozen beside the entrance. Dad reached toward the folder. Let me see that. I closed it. Astron Mobility Group's estimated enterprise value is approximately $2.3 billion. Mom looked at me as if I had suddenly become someone else. You have $2 billion? No. That seemed to confuse her even more. The company is valued at that amount. That includes its operating businesses, contracts, infrastructure, vehicles, aviation assets, and other holdings. It doesn't mean I have $2.3 billion sitting in a bank account. But you own it. I founded it and I remain the controlling owner. Dad sank into a nearby chair. Melissa was still standing. How did this even happen? That was the first question anyone had asked that mattered. I looked at her. I started by coordinating commuter transportation for businesses. At 22, the same year Mom refused to help me buy that used car, I was arranging transportation for companies that needed reliable ways to move employees between offices, transit stations, and work sites. The margins were small. So, I reinvested almost everything. We won larger contracts. Then, we started operating some of the routes ourselves. Melissa nodded slowly. The buses. The buses came next. After that came airport shuttle networks. Then, freight and logistics. Years later, when Astron had the capital and operational infrastructure to expand again, we acquired an executive aviation operator. I glanced through the windows. The helicopters outside weren't toys I had purchased to impress anyone. They were business assets, part of an aviation subsidiary inside a transportation group that had taken more than a decade to build. Mom lowered herself into the chair beside Dad. Then she asked the question she had been circling all evening. Then why don't you own a car? I almost laughed. Not because the question was funny, because even after seeing everything around her, she still couldn't separate success from a driveway. I have access to company vehicles whenever I need them. That's not what I asked. I know. I sat across from her. I live near transit. Most places I regularly go are easily accessible by train. And transportation is my business, Mom. She frowned. So I need to experience it. I explained that spreadsheets could tell me a route had an average delay of 11 minutes. They couldn't tell me what standing on a freezing platform for those 11 minutes felt like. A customer service report could record complaints about ticket machines. It couldn't show me the elderly passenger who gave up because the screen was confusing. A cleanliness metric could be marked acceptable while the actual station smelled terrible. I've changed Astron services because of things I've experienced while riding anonymously. Melissa leaned against the table. So when Mom thought you were taking buses because you couldn't afford a car, I was sometimes riding our own routes. Mom looked away. For years, she treated the habit as evidence that I had failed. It had actually helped me run the company that made me wealthy. She folded her hands. Well, maybe some of what I said was harsh. Some. I was trying to motivate you. There it was. A softer explanation for the same behavior. Do you remember when I was 22? Her eyes dropped. I asked you for help buying one used car. I was trying to keep the business alive and get between client meetings. That was years ago. You told me I'd never own a car until I learned how the real world worked. Mom said nothing. A few months later, you helped Melissa with her first luxury car. Melissa looked sharply at Mom. I didn't know that. I never blamed you. I kept my eyes on Mom. And that's the point. This was never about Melissa having cars. It wasn't even about you refusing me money. You were entitled to say no. Then what was it about? Mom asked. Respect. The word stopped her. You respected what you could display. Cars, houses, titles you understood. You never asked what I was building because you had already decided it couldn't be important. Dad shifted in his chair. Come on, Judith. The pathetic thing at dinner was a joke. I turned towards him. Would you have made that joke if you'd known what Astron was worth? His mouth opened, then closed. I waited. He looked away. That silence answered everything. Melissa stepped forward. Actually, I need to say something. Mom sighed. Melissa, please. No. She pulled out the chair beside me. I never asked you to use me against Judith. Mom's face tightened. I was proud of you. Being proud of me isn't the problem. Melissa gestured toward the windows. I love my cars. Judith knows that, but owning 4 cars doesn't make me better than her. Nobody interrupted. Every time I bought something, you turned it into evidence that I was winning. Do you know what that did? Mom stared at her. It made Judith feel like she was never enough. And it made me feel like I had to keep achieving things you could show people. For once, Mom had no favorite daughter to hide behind. Melissa had stepped out of the competition, and suddenly there was no competition left. A senior executive approached me. Judith, the regional partners are ready whenever you are. I'll be there in a minute. He nodded respectfully and moved on. Another executive stopped briefly to ask about a route expansion. Then an operations director wanted confirmation on an acquisition timeline. Nobody asked what I drove. Nobody cared. Mom watched each interaction. Her phone rang. She checked the screen and frowned. It was Aunt Carol. Melissa had apparently sent her a message earlier. Mom answered reluctantly. Yes. A pause. Her eyes closed. No, Carol, I didn't know. Another pause. Yes, apparently she founded it. Mom hung up. Dad looked at her. What? She put the phone face down. Everyone knows. The Thanksgiving story had changed. It would no longer be about Judith Carter, the 34-year-old daughter who still couldn't afford a car. It would be about the parents who mocked their daughter for taking public transportation without realizing she had built a transportation group worth approximately $2.3 billion. Dad cleared his throat. Well, I recognized that tone immediately. If the company is doing this well, maybe there are opportunities for the family. Melissa groaned. Dad. What? I'm just asking. He leaned toward me. Investments? Maybe positions somewhere. Melissa has business experience. There could be things we could all participate in. No. The answer came easily. Dad blinked. You haven't even heard the idea. Astron's assets aren't family money. His expression hardened. I'm your father. And Astron has employees, investors, executives, and governance procedures. Nobody gets a position because they're related to me. What about investment opportunities? Any legitimate proposal goes through the same process as everyone else's. Mom stared at me. So, after everything, you're going to treat us like strangers? No. I'm going to stop treating being family as permission to disrespect me. She flinched. I continued calmly. I'll have a relationship with you, but there will be no more public humiliation, no more financial comparisons, no more using Melissa to measure my worth. Mom folded her arms. And if we make a mistake? If you insult me publicly, I leave. If you start comparing us, I leave. If you try to use my money as the price of suddenly respecting me, I leave. Neither parent answered. Outside, the final helicopter settled onto the area. Astron's insignia gleamed beneath the lights. Mom walked toward the window. Hours earlier, she had laughed because her younger daughter owned 4 cars while I had arrived by train. Now, she was staring at aircraft belonging to a transportation group I controlled. Dad eventually stood. We should go. I nodded. He hesitated. Do you want us to drive you home? I checked my phone. A train was leaving soon. No thanks. Mom turned around. You're taking the train? Yes. She looked genuinely baffled. After all this? I put on my coat. Because I like the train. Months passed. I remained executive chair and controlling owner of Astron. I also kept using public transportation. Sometimes for work. Sometimes because it was convenient. Sometimes simply because I wanted to. Mom stopped making jokes about it. Dad never called me pathetic again. And at family gatherings, Diane stopped announcing Melissa's latest purchase as proof that one daughter had somehow beaten the other. Melissa and I became closer once neither of us agreed to participate in that game. My relationship with my parents survived, but on different terms. I attended when I wanted to. If the comparison started, I left. I never bought 4 luxury cars to prove Mom wrong. I didn't buy one just to make a point either. Doing that would have meant accepting the rules she'd spent years trying to impose on me. That success needed 4 wheels, a recognizable badge, and a place in the driveway. One evening after work, I walked through the station and boarded an ordinary train. As the doors prepared to close, I looked through the window. Far beyond the city, an Asteron helicopter crossed the evening sky until it became a small silhouette against the fading light. I smiled and took my seat. Mom had been right about one thing. I still didn't own a car. Because somewhere along the way, I'd stopped trying to own the symbol of success and built the transportation empire instead.